The study at Pemberton House was cold that morning, despite the fire crackling in the marble hearth. Alistair Beaumont, the Duke of Pemberton, sat behind his mahogany desk with his head in his hands. Before him lay a stack of applications, 23 letters from women across England, each one promising to be the perfect governess for his children. He had read this same promise 4 times before. 4 different women, 4 spectacular failures. The problem wasn't the governesses. The problem was Thomas and Georgiana. His son was 10 years old now, his daughter 8. 2 years ago their mother had died, giving birth to a child who never drew breath. In those 2 years, Alistair had watched his children transform from laughing, energetic souls into silent ghosts who drifted through the halls of Pemberton House like prisoners. They barely spoke. They barely smiled. And every governess he hired, no matter how qualified, no matter how kind, they drove away within weeks. Thomas would hide their belongings. Georgiana would refuse to speak for days. Together, they created an atmosphere so hostile that even the most patient woman eventually fled in tears. Alistair couldn't blame them. His children were punishing the world for taking their mother, and he, drowning in his duties to Parliament and his estates, had no idea how to reach them. He was failing, a duke with all the power and wealth in England, and he couldn't help his own children heal. The butler knocked softly. "Your Grace, Miss Mary Ann Morton has arrived for her interview." Alistair straightened, composing himself. Another candidate, another woman who would promise miracles and deliver nothing. He had stopped hoping weeks ago, but when Mary Ann Morton entered his study, something shifted in the air. She was younger than he expected, perhaps 25, with dark hair pinned simply beneath a modest bonnet. Her dress was plain but well made, the kind a respectable woman of limited means would wear to make a good impression. Her posture was perfect, her hands folded calmly before her. But it was her eyes that caught him. They were guarded, watchful, like someone who had learned to read danger before it arrived. "Miss Morton," Alistair said, gesturing to the chair across from his desk. "Please sit." She sat with practiced grace, her back straight, her expression neutral. "Thank you, Your Grace." He glanced down at her application. Her references were impeccable. 2 previous positions with respectable families, glowing recommendations about her teaching abilities and her character. Everything looked perfect. Too perfect, perhaps. "Your qualifications are impressive," Alistair said slowly. "You've taught literature, mathematics, history, music. You speak French and Italian. You have experience with children of various ages." He looked up at her. "Why then are you seeking a new position? Your previous employer gave you an excellent recommendation." Something flickered across her face, so brief he almost missed it. Fear, sadness, it vanished before he could name it. "The family relocated to Scotland," she said smoothly. "I preferred to remain in England." It was a reasonable answer. But Alistair's instincts, honed through years of navigating politics and reading men who lied for a living, told him it wasn't the complete truth. "I see," he said. He leaned back in his chair, studying her. "Miss Morton, I should be honest with you. This position is not an easy one. My children are—" He paused, choosing his words carefully. "They are grieving. Their mother passed 2 years ago, and they have not recovered. The previous governesses found them difficult to manage." "Difficult how?" Mary Ann asked. Her voice was steady, but something in her tone suggested genuine interest rather than polite inquiry. "They're defiant, manipulative. They test boundaries constantly. They want to drive you away, Miss Morton, and they're very good at it. Most women would have hesitated at this point. Most would have offered nervous reassurances or made excuses to leave." Mary Ann simply nodded. "Grief makes us do terrible things," she said quietly, "especially when we're young and don't have words for what we feel." Alistair blinked. It wasn't the response he expected. "You speak from experience?" Her jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. "Everyone experiences loss, Your Grace. The question is whether we're given the space to heal from it. There was weight behind those words. A story she wasn't telling. Alistair found himself leaning forward, curious despite himself. "What is your philosophy on teaching, Miss Morton?" "I believe children learn best when they feel seen," she said. "Not controlled or managed, but truly seen. They need to know their thoughts matter, their feelings are valid, that they're not simply vessels to be filled with information, but human beings with minds worth developing." She paused, then added softly, "And I believe that education should help them find beauty in the world again, especially when the world has been cruel." Alistair stared at her. For the first time in months, perhaps years, he felt something stir in his chest. Hope? No, that was too strong a word, but something close to it. He should have asked more questions. He should have pressed about the gaps in her employment history, about why her references used her maiden name when she had mentioned once being married. He should have been cautious. Instead, he said, "When can you start?" Marianne's eyes widened slightly. "You're offering me the position?" "I am." "You don't want to think about it? Interview other candidates?" "No," Alistair said firmly. "I've read enough applications and conducted enough interviews to know when someone is right." "You're right, Miss Morton. I can't explain it, but I know it." For a moment something vulnerable crossed her face, relief mixed with guilt. Then she composed herself and nodded. "I can start tomorrow, Your Grace." "Tomorrow, then." He stood and extended his hand. She took it, her grip surprisingly strong. As she turned to leave, Alistair found himself speaking again. "Miss Morton, whatever you're running from, you're safe here. I want you to know that." She froze in the doorway, her back to him. For several heartbeats she didn't move. Then, without turning around, she said softly, "Thank you, Your Grace. I hope that remains true." And she was gone. Alistair sat back down, staring at the closed door. He had just hired a woman who was clearly hiding something. A woman who had lied on her application, who was running from some unnamed trouble, who might bring scandal or danger to his household, and yet somehow he knew he had made the right choice. He just didn't know why. Not yet. Marianne Morton's first day in the schoolroom did not go as most first days went. She had expected resistance. The Duke had warned her, after all. But she hadn't quite anticipated the sheer creativity of Thomas and Georgiana's defiance. When she entered the schoolroom that first morning, both children were already seated at their desks. Thomas, a serious-looking boy with his father's dark hair and sharp features, stared out the window as though she didn't exist. Georgiana, smaller and delicate with blonde curls, had her arms crossed tightly over her chest and her eyes fixed on the floor. Neither acknowledged her greeting. Marianne set her books down on the teacher's desk and surveyed the room. It was a beautiful space, tall windows letting in morning light, shelves lined with leather-bound volumes, a globe in the corner, maps on the walls. Everything a child could need to learn, everything except the desire to do so. "Good morning," she said again, keeping her voice warm but not overly cheerful. "My name is Miss Morton. I'll be teaching you from now on." Silence. "I thought we might begin with literature today," Marianne continued, moving to the bookshelf. "Have either of you read Shakespeare?" Thomas finally turned from the window. "Shakespeare is boring," he said flatly. "All those stupid people falling in love and dying. What's the point?" It was a test. Marianne recognized it immediately. He wanted to shock her, to make her angry, to give him an excuse to escalate. She simply nodded. "That's a fair criticism. Shakespeare does have a lot of death in his plays. But before we decide it's all boring, perhaps we should give it a chance. If you still think it's stupid after today, we'll try something else. Does that seem reasonable?" Thomas blinked, clearly not expecting agreement. Georgiana glanced up for the first time, curiosity flickering across her face. Marianne pulled a worn copy of A Midsummer Night's Dream from the shelf and sat down in the chair between their desks, not behind the teacher's desk in a position of authority, but among them as though they were equals. "This one has magic in it," she said. Fairies and spells and people falling in love with donkeys. It's actually quite ridiculous when you think about it. People fall in love with donkeys? Georgiana asked, her voice barely above a whisper. It was the first time she had spoken. Well, one person does, because of a magic spell. Shall I read it to you and we'll see if it's as boring as your brother thinks? Thomas shrugged, which Marianne took as permission. She opened the book and began to read. But she didn't simply read the words. She performed them. Her voice changed with each character, deep and commanding for Theseus, light and imperious for Titania, mischievous and playful for Puck. She didn't just speak the lines, she inhabited them, bringing the forest of Athens to life in that quiet schoolroom. Her hands moved as she described the magic. Her face shifted with each emotion. Her voice rose and fell like music. Thomas stopped staring out the window. Georgiana uncrossed her arms. By the time Marianne reached the scene where Bottom transforms into a donkey, both children were leaning forward in their seats, completely absorbed. When she read Puck's final speech, her voice soft and conspiratorial as though sharing a secret, Georgiana actually smiled. It was a small smile, barely there, but it was real. Marianne closed the book. "So," she said, "still boring?" Thomas hesitated, clearly torn between his desire to maintain his defiance and his genuine interest in the story. Finally, he said, "It was okay. Better than I expected." "High praise," Marianne said with a slight smile. "We'll continue tomorrow, then." The rest of the day went more smoothly. Not perfectly. Thomas still challenged her on mathematics, and Georgiana refused to practice her penmanship, but something had shifted. They were no longer trying to drive her away. They were testing her, yes, but with curiosity now instead of hostility. That evening, as the house settled into quiet, Alistair found himself walking past the schoolroom. He hadn't meant to. He had been heading to his study to review some parliamentary documents when he heard it, a voice drifting through the closed door. Marianne's voice. She was reading to the children before bed, something none of the previous governesses had thought to do. Alistair stopped in the corridor, his hand on the wall, and listened. She was reading poetry now, something lyrical and gentle, her voice rising and falling like waves. And beneath it, he heard something he hadn't heard in 2 years, his children laughing. Not polite laughter, not forced smiles, real, genuine laughter, the kind that came from the belly, the kind that meant joy. Alistair closed his eyes and let the sound wash over him. For the first time since his wife's death, the house felt alive again. And it was because of this woman, this mysterious woman with secrets in her eyes and magic in her voice. He didn't know what to do with the feeling growing in his chest, so he simply stood there in the darkened hallway and listened until the reading ended, and Marianne's footsteps approached the door. He slipped away before she could see him, his heart pounding like a schoolboy's. Over the following weeks, Marianne transformed not just the schoolroom, but the entire atmosphere of Pemberton House. She taught history as adventure stories, bringing ancient Rome and medieval England to life with the same theatrical flair she brought to Shakespeare. She turned mathematics into puzzles and games, challenging the children to solve problems as though they were secret codes. She taught them songs in French and Italian, her voice blending with theirs in simple harmonies that echoed through the halls. But more than the academics, she taught them how to feel again. When Thomas grew frustrated with a difficult lesson, she didn't scold him for his temper. She sat beside him and said, "I understand. Sometimes things are hard and it makes us angry. That's okay. Let's take a breath and try again." When Georgiana had nightmares about her mother, something she confessed one afternoon in tears, Marianne didn't offer empty platitudes. She simply held the girl and said, "I know. Loss is the hardest thing. But your mother loved you, and that love doesn't disappear just because she's gone. It stays in your heart forever." The servants noticed the change. Mrs. Patterson, the housekeeper, remarked to the butler that she hadn't seen the children smile so much in years. The cook started preparing their favorite meals again, because they were actually eating. Even the footman commented that the house felt warmer somehow, as though summer had arrived early. And every evening, Alistair found himself drawn to that hallway outside the schoolroom. He told himself he was simply checking on his children's progress, ensuring the new governess was performing her duties adequately. But the truth was simpler and more dangerous. He was falling in love with the sound of her voice, not just the beauty of it, though it was beautiful, warm and expressive and full of life, but what the voice represented: safety, healing, hope, everything he thought he had lost when his wife died. He knew it was inappropriate. She was his employee. She was beneath his station socially, regardless of her genteel manners and education. She was hiding something. He was certain of that now. Getting involved would be foolish at best, scandalous at worst. But knowing all of that didn't stop his heart from racing. When he heard her sing lullabies to Georgiana, it didn't stop him from finding excuses to walk past the schoolroom during lessons. It didn't stop him from thinking about her late at night, when the house was quiet, and he sat alone in his study with a glass of brandy and too many thoughts. One particular evening changed everything. Alistair was in the library reviewing correspondence when he heard singing in the corridor. Marianne's voice carrying Georgiana to bed after the girl had fallen asleep during their reading time. The lullaby was ancient and haunting, something about stars and dreams and safety. Without thinking, Alistair rose and moved toward the sound. He stood in the shadows of the hallway and watched as Marianne gently laid Georgiana in her bed, still humming that sweet melody. The girl's small hand clutched Marianne's sleeve, unwilling to let go even in sleep. Marianne carefully extracted her hand and pulled the blankets up to Georgiana's chin. She brushed a strand of blonde hair from the child's face with such tenderness that Alistair felt his throat tighten. This wasn't a governess performing her duties. This was a woman who genuinely loved his daughter. And in that moment, Alistair knew the truth he had been avoiding for weeks. He wasn't just grateful to Marianne for helping his children. He was in love with her. Not just her voice, not just what she represented, but her, the woman herself. Her strength and gentleness. Her ability to see his children's pain and meet it with compassion instead of judgment. Her quiet courage in the face of whatever demons haunted her past. He loved her. And he had absolutely no idea what to do about it. Alistair told himself he was being paranoid. He told himself that his growing feelings for Marianne were clouding his judgment, making him see problems where none existed. But late at night, when he couldn't sleep, he found himself returning to the same troubling questions. Who was Marianne Morton, really? And what was she hiding? It started small, a comment from Mrs. Patterson about how Miss Morton never received letters from family. An observation from the butler that she had arrived with only one small trunk of belongings, unusual for a woman of her education and background. The way Marianne would tense whenever someone knocked on the front door unexpectedly, as though she expected trouble to walk through it at any moment. Alistair tried to dismiss these observations. Many people lived quietly. Many had complicated family situations. But his instincts, the same instincts that had served him well in Parliament, where men lied as easily as they breathed, told him something was wrong. One evening, he retrieved Marianne's application from his desk drawer and read it again, this time more carefully. The references were excellent, yes, but they were also vague. They praised her teaching abilities and her character in general terms, but provided few specific details. The dates of her previous employment had gaps, months unaccounted for, and there was that discrepancy with her name. Some documents listed her as Marianne Morton, her maiden name. Others mentioned a married name, Ashton, that she never used. Alistair sat back in his chair, rubbing his temples. He didn't want to investigate her. It felt like a betrayal of the trust growing between them. But he had his children to think about. If Marianne was involved in something dangerous, If her past could threaten Thomas and Georgiana's safety, he needed to know. The decision made him sick to his stomach, but he made it anyway. He sent word to a private investigator he had used before, a discreet man who handled sensitive matters for various members of the aristocracy. Alistair provided what information he had and asked for a full background report. Then he waited, guilt gnawing at him with every passing day. The investigator returned 2 weeks later with a folder of documents and a grim expression. "Your Grace," the man said, settling into the chair across from Alistair's desk, "the woman calling herself Mary Ann Morton has a complicated past." Alistair's stomach dropped. "Go on." "Her maiden name is indeed Morton. She's the daughter of a country vicar who died 5 years ago. Her mother passed when she was a child. So far, everything in her application is truthful." The investigator paused. "However, 6 years ago she married a man named Edmund Ashton." "Viscount Ashton." "The marriage appears to have been troubled from the start." "Troubled how?" "Ashton was a gambler, reckless with money. There are rumors, unconfirmed but persistent, that he was abusive toward his wife. She was seen with bruises on several occasions, though she always claimed they were accidents." The investigator's voice was carefully neutral, but Alistair could hear the disgust beneath it. 3 years into the marriage, Mary Ann disappeared, simply vanished. Ashton claimed she had gone to stay with relatives, but no one could confirm her whereabouts. Alistair's hands clenched into fists. "And Ashton?" "He died 3 months ago. A hunting accident, officially. But there are questions about the circumstances. He was heavily in debt, involved with some dangerous people, smugglers, possibly worse. His death was convenient for several parties." "Are you suggesting Mary Ann had something to do with it?" "No, Your Grace. In fact, there's no evidence she was anywhere near him when he died. But here's what concerns me. Immediately after his death, several men began looking for her. Dangerous men. The kind who work for people who don't like loose ends." Alistair felt cold dread settle in his chest. "What kind of people?" "Ashton was involved in smuggling operations along the coast, possibly information trafficking as well, selling secrets to French agents. When he died, those operations were disrupted. Someone wants to know what Mary Ann knows about her late husband's activities, and they're willing to pay well to find her." The room seemed to tilt. Alistair gripped the edge of his desk to steady himself. "Is she in danger?" "Potentially, yes. If these people discover where she is, they may try to question her, or eliminate her if they think she's a threat." The investigator leaned forward. "Your Grace, I must advise you to terminate her employment immediately, for your own protection and that of your children." "No," Alistair said immediately. The word came out harder than he intended. The investigator blinked. "Your Grace..." "No," Alistair repeated. "If she's in danger, then dismissing her would only make her more vulnerable. She stays here where I can protect her. With respect, sir, you may be putting your family at risk. That's my decision to make." Alistair stood, signaling the end of the conversation. "Thank you for your work. Send your bill to my solicitor, and speak of this to no one." After the investigator left, Alistair sat alone in his study for hours, staring at the folder of information. Mary Ann had been married to an abusive man. She had escaped somehow, been on the run for years, always looking over her shoulder. And now that her husband was dead, she still wasn't safe. Everything made sense now. Her wariness, her secrecy, the way she had said she needed this position urgently. She wasn't just looking for employment. She was looking for a place to hide. Alistair should have been angry at the deception. He should have felt betrayed. Instead, all he felt was a fierce protective instinct and a burning rage at the men who had hurt her and were still hunting her. He would keep her safe, whatever it took. But first, he needed to give her a chance to tell him the truth herself. 3 days later, Alistair's worst fears were confirmed when a letter arrived. It was addressed to Miss Mary Ann Morton in a formal hand, with a London postmark. The butler brought it to Alistair automatically, as was protocol for all staff correspondence. Alistair stared at the envelope, his heart pounding. He shouldn't open it. It was her private correspondence. But something about the formality of it, the weight of the paper, told him it was important. He broke the seal. The letter was from a solicitor's office, discussing matters related to the estate of the late Viscount Edmund Ashton. It referenced an inheritance claim, outstanding debts, and, most alarmingly, a request for Mrs. Mary Ann Ashton to appear at a court hearing within the month regarding matters of urgency related to her late husband's affairs. Alistair read the letter 3 times, his mind racing. Mary Ann would have to go to London. She would have to appear in court, which would make her location known to anyone watching. If the dangerous men the investigator mentioned were still looking for her, this would lead them straight to her. He had to warn her. He had to tell her what he knew. But how could he explain that he had investigated her? That he had read her private correspondence? The answer was simple: he couldn't. Not yet. He would wait and see if she came to him herself, if she trusted him enough to tell him the truth. But every day she didn't tell him felt like a small betrayal, even though he knew it wasn't fair to expect her to confide in him. They weren't equals. He was her employer. She had every reason to keep her secrets. Still, the waiting was agony. That evening, unable to sleep, Alistair went downstairs to the library, hoping a book might distract him from his thoughts. He was surprised to find the room already occupied. Mary Ann sat in one of the leather chairs by the fireplace, still dressed, staring into the dying flames. Her face was wet with tears she had clearly been trying to hide. She looked up when she heard him enter, quickly wiping her cheeks. "Your Grace, forgive me. I didn't mean to intrude." "You're not intruding," Alistair said gently. He moved closer, sitting in the chair across from hers. "Mary Ann, are you all right?" The use of her first name made her eyes widen slightly. "I'm fine. It's nothing. I should return to my room." "Please don't," Alistair said. "Stay, talk to me." She looked at him for a long moment, conflict clear in her expression. Finally, she said softly, "I can't, Your Grace. There are things I'm not free to—" Her voice broke. Alistair leaned forward. "Whatever burden you're carrying, you don't have to carry it alone. I can help you, Mary Ann. I want to help you. But you have to trust me." For a moment he thought she would confess everything. Her lips parted. Her eyes filled with desperate longing to be known, to be helped. But then fear won. She stood abruptly. "You're very kind, Your Grace, but some burdens can't be shared. They can only be endured." She moved toward the door, then paused without turning around. "Thank you for caring. It means more than you know." And then she was gone, leaving Alistair alone with a cold fireplace and the certain knowledge that time was running out. Whatever Mary Ann was running from was catching up to her. And when it arrived, it would destroy everything they had built, unless he could find a way to save her first. Alistair knew he couldn't wait any longer. Every day that passed increased the danger to Mary Ann, and keeping the knowledge of the letter secret felt like complicity in whatever threat she faced. The next morning he asked Mrs. Patterson to send Mary Ann to his study after lessons concluded. When the housekeeper raised her eyebrows questioningly, Alistair simply said it was a matter requiring discussion. Nothing more. He spent the intervening hours rehearsing what he would say, how he would approach the conversation, without making her feel trapped or accused. But when Mary Ann finally knocked on his study door that afternoon, all his careful planning evaporated. She entered with her usual composed expression, hands folded neatly before her, but he could see the tension in her shoulders, the wariness in her eyes. She knew something was wrong. "You asked to see me, Your Grace." Her voice was steady, professional. The voice of an employee speaking to her employer, nothing more. Alistair stood from behind his desk, unable to remain seated for this conversation. From his drawer he withdrew the letter, the one from the solicitor, and held it up. "This arrived 3 days ago. It's addressed to you." The colour drained from Mary Ann's face so quickly, Alistair thought she might faint. She gripped the back of the chair in front of her, her knuckles white against the dark wood. For several long seconds she said nothing, just stared at the letter as though it were a death sentence. "You opened my correspondence," she finally said, her voice barely above a whisper. "Yes." Alistair didn't apologize. He couldn't, not when her safety was at stake. "Marianne, I need to know. Who are you? What are you running from? And who was Edmund Ashton?" She flinched at the name as though he had struck her. Her carefully constructed walls crumbled all at once. She sank into the chair, her hands covering her face, her shoulders shaking with silent sobs. Alistair moved around the desk immediately, kneeling beside her chair, but he didn't touch her. He simply waited, giving her space to compose herself. When she finally lowered her hands, her face was blotchy with tears, but her eyes held a terrible resignation. "You want the truth," she said hoarsely. "All of it." "Yes. Even if it changes everything? Even if you send me away after hearing it?" "I won't send you away," Alistair said firmly. "But I need to understand what we're facing." Marianne took a shuddering breath and began to speak. The story poured out of her like water from a broken dam, years of secrets finally finding voice. "I was 18 when I married Edmund Ashton," she said, staring at her hands. "My father had just died. I had no money, no family, no prospects. Edmund seemed kind at first, charming. He promised me security, a good home. I thought I was fortunate." Her laugh was bitter. "I was so naive." Alistair remained silent, letting her continue at her own pace. "The marriage was a nightmare from the beginning. Edmund was—" She paused, searching for words. "He was cruel. Not always with his fists, though there was that too. Mostly he was cruel with words, with control. He dictated everything, what I wore, who I spoke to, where I went. He kept me isolated in his country estate for months at a time. When I tried to object, he would remind me that I had nothing. No money of my own. No family to return to. I was completely dependent on him." Alistair's jaw tightened with rage, but he forced himself to remain calm. This wasn't about his feelings. This was about her finally being heard. "He had mistresses," Marianne continued. "Multiple women, sometimes bringing them to our home while I was there. He wanted me to know I was replaceable, worthless. He enjoyed my humiliation." She wiped her eyes roughly. "But the worst part was the gambling. Edmund was reckless with money. He lost thousands on cards, on horses, on ridiculous investments. When his inheritance ran out, he turned to other means of income." "Smuggling," Alistair said quietly. Marianne's head snapped up. "You know about that? I had you investigated. I'm sorry. I needed to know if my children were in danger." She nodded slowly, seeming to accept this. "Yes, smuggling. He was involved with a network of men trafficking goods along the coast. Brandy, silk, tobacco, anything that could avoid taxes. But it wasn't just goods. They were also moving information, selling English secrets to French agents. Edmund thought it was exciting, like he was playing some grand game. He didn't care that it was treason. And you knew about this?" "I didn't want to know. But I saw things, heard conversations. Men would come to the house late at night, dangerous men with cold eyes. They would meet with Edmund in his study, and I would hear raised voices, threats. One night I overheard them discussing a shipment of documents, military intelligence that Edmund had acquired somehow. They were planning to sell it to Napoleon's network. I was terrified, but I didn't know what to do. If I went to the authorities, Edmund would have destroyed me. And I had no proof, just what I'd overheard." Alistair's mind raced. This was worse than he had imagined. Marianne wasn't just running from an abusive marriage. She was a witness to treason. 2 years into the marriage, I couldn't bear it anymore, Marianne said. I started planning my escape. I saved small amounts of money whenever I could. I contacted a distant cousin who agreed to help me. One night when Edmund was in London, I left. I took almost nothing, just some clothes and what little money I had hidden. I used my maiden name, Morton, and I disappeared. How did you survive? I moved constantly, took positions as a governess under false references. I paid a woman to forge them for me. I never stayed anywhere longer than 6 months. I lived in constant fear that Edmund would find me, that he would drag me back and punish me for leaving. But months passed, then years. I began to think I might actually be free. And then he died. Yes, Marianne's voice was hollow. 3 months ago. A hunting accident, they said. But Edmund was an excellent shot. He didn't have accidents. I think someone killed him. Someone involved in his smuggling operations. Maybe he became a liability. Maybe he knew too much. I don't know. But when I heard he was dead, I didn't feel relief. I felt more afraid than ever. Because you knew something, Alistair said, understanding dawning. About the smuggling, about the treason, and whoever killed Edmund would want to make sure you couldn't talk. Exactly. Marianne looked at him with desperate eyes. That's why I came here. Pemberton House felt like a place I could disappear, at least for a while. A duke's household, respectable and protected. I thought I could hide here until the danger passed. But that letter, she gestured weakly toward the document still in Alistair's hand. If I have to appear in court, if I have to go to London publicly, they'll find me. The men Edmund worked with. And they'll want to ensure I can never testify about what I know. Alistair stood, pacing to the window. Outside, the gardens of Pemberton House stretched peaceful and green in the afternoon sun. His children were out there somewhere with one of the maids, safe and happy. Everything he had worked to build, to protect, it was all potentially at risk because of Marianne's past. And he didn't care. He turned back to face her. "Marianne, look at me." She raised her tear-stained face. "I don't care about your past," he said firmly. "I don't care that you lied on your application. I don't care that you used a false name. You did what you had to do to survive an impossible situation. There is no shame in that. But the danger, we'll face it together." He moved closer, kneeling again so they were at eye level. "What I care about, what I need to know is this. Are your feelings for me real? Because mine for you are. I'm in love with you, Marianne. I have been for weeks. I love your strength, your courage, your compassion for my children. I love the way you've brought life back into this house. I love you, not despite your complicated past, but as a complete person who has survived terrible things and remained kind." He took her hand carefully, giving her the chance to pull away. She didn't. "So I'm asking you now, plainly, do you feel what I feel? Is there something between us worth fighting for?" Marianne stared at him, fresh tears streaming down her face. For a long moment, she seemed unable to speak. Then finally she whispered, "Yes, God help me, yes. I love you, Alistair. I've loved you almost from the beginning. But I was so afraid. Afraid of dragging you into my nightmare, afraid of ruining everything you've built, afraid of losing you the moment you knew the truth." "You're not going to lose me," Alistair said. He stood, pulling her up with him, and cupped her face gently in his hands. "Whatever comes next, we face it together. Do you understand? You're not alone anymore, Marianne. You don't have to run. You don't have to hide. I will stand beside you and we will find a way through this." She collapsed against him, sobbing into his chest while he held her. Years of fear and loneliness poured out of her, and Alistair simply held her through it, stroking her hair and murmuring reassurances. When she finally quieted, she pulled back enough to look up at him. "What do we do?" she asked. "We go to someone I trust, someone with connections who can help us." Alistair was already forming a plan. "Lord James Westland. He's an earl, a friend from my university days, and he has ties to the Home Office. If what you know about Edmund's treason is valuable, the government will want to protect you. They'll want your testimony, and in exchange they can offer you safety. You think they'll believe me?" "I'll make them believe you." Alistair's voice was steel. "No one threatens someone I love and gets away with it. We'll expose the entire smuggling network. We'll bring these men to justice, and we'll make sure you're free, truly free from all of it." Marianne searched his face, and whatever she saw there seemed to reassure her. She nodded slowly. "All right. I trust you. Good. Alistair pressed a kiss to her forehead, allowing himself that small intimacy. We'll send word to Westland tonight. In the meantime, you stay close to the house. Don't go anywhere alone. And Marianne... He waited until she met his eyes. Thank you for trusting me with the truth. I know how much it cost you. Thank you for not sending me away, she whispered. Never, Alistair promised. I will never send you away. 3 days after Marianne's confession, the danger she had warned about arrived at Pemberton House. Alistair was in his study reviewing correspondence when the butler entered, his normally composed face tight with concern. Your Grace, there are 3 men at the door requesting to speak with you. They claim to represent creditors of the late Viscount Ashton. They're asking about Miss Morton. Alistair's blood ran cold. He had known this moment would come, but not so soon. Show them to the drawing room, and send word to the stables to have my fastest horse ready, just in case. Then find Miss Morton, and tell her to stay in her chambers with the children. Lock the door. The butler nodded and disappeared. Alistair took a moment to compose himself, then walked to the drawing room with measured steps. The 3 men waiting there were not creditors. That much was obvious from the moment he saw them. They were hard-faced men with calculating eyes, dressed well enough to pass inspection, but carrying themselves like soldiers, or worse, like men who dealt in violence for profit. Gentlemen, Alistair said coolly, I understand you have business to discuss. The tallest of the 3 stepped forward. His face was scarred, his voice rough. Your Grace, we apologize for the intrusion. We represent certain parties with interests in the late Viscount Ashton's estate. We have reason to believe that Mrs. Marianne Ashton, formerly employed as a governess in your household, may possess documents or information relevant to settling his affairs. Miss Morton is indeed employed here, Alistair said carefully. However, I'm not aware of any documents in her possession. Perhaps she hasn't mentioned them. Women can be forgetful about such things. The man's smile didn't reach his eyes. We'd like to speak with her directly. Just a brief conversation to clarify a few matters. That won't be possible. Miss Morton is occupied with her duties. Your Grace, I don't think you understand the situation. The man's voice hardened. Viscount Ashton was involved in certain business arrangements before his death. Arrangements that powerful people have invested in heavily. His widow may have knowledge of these arrangements, names, locations, records. We need that information, and we need it quickly. Alistair felt rage building in his chest, but kept his voice level. Are you threatening me in my own home? Not at all, Your Grace. We're simply explaining the stakes. Mrs. Ashton's cooperation would be beneficial for everyone involved. Her non-cooperation would be unfortunate, for her and for anyone protecting her. The implicit threat was clear. These men knew Marianne was here. They knew Alistair was sheltering her, and they were willing to hurt anyone who stood in their way. Alistair walked to the door and opened it. 2 footmen stood in the hallway, large men he had positioned there deliberately. Gentlemen, this conversation is over. You will leave my property immediately. If you return, I will have you arrested for trespassing. The scarred man studied him for a long moment, then shrugged. As you wish, Your Grace, but this matter won't disappear simply because you refuse to discuss it. Mrs. Ashton can't hide forever. And when we find her, and we will find her, it would be better for everyone if she cooperates voluntarily. He tipped his hat mockingly. Good day. The 3 men left, escorted out by the footman. Alistair watched from the window until their carriage disappeared down the drive, then immediately went to find Marianne. She was in her chambers as instructed, pale and shaking, with Thomas and Georgiana sitting close to her on either side. The children looked frightened, sensing the tension even if they didn't understand it. They came, Marianne said. It wasn't a question. Yes? Alistair knelt before her, taking her hands. Marianne, you can't stay here. They know where you are now. They'll come back, and next time they might not ask politely. You need to leave somewhere they can't find you, While I contact Westland and arrange protection, where would I go? I have a hunting lodge in Scotland. Remote, defensible. You'd be safe there until— No! Marianne stood abruptly. No, I won't do that. I won't run again, Alistair. I won't spend the rest of my life looking over my shoulder, waiting for them to find me. And I won't put your children in danger by staying. Then what do you suggest? Her face was resolute despite her fear. I'll leave tonight. I'll go to London, present myself to the authorities, tell them everything I know. Let the government protect me if they will. But I can't stay here and risk bringing violence to this house. Absolutely not, Alistair said firmly. You're not going anywhere alone. Alistair, no. He gripped her shoulders gently. I told you we faced this together. That means I'm coming with you. Alistair refused to let Marianne face the authorities alone. That same evening, they departed for London with 2 armed footmen and a carefully drafted letter of introduction to Lord James Westland. The journey took most of the night, and by the time they arrived at Westland's London townhouse at dawn, both were exhausted but resolved. Thomas and Georgiana had been left in Mrs. Patterson's care, with strict instructions that no one was to know where their father had gone. Westland, despite being roused from sleep, listened to their story with growing alarm. He was a man in his late 30s, with sharp intelligence and connections throughout the government. After hearing everything Marianne had to say about Edmund's smuggling network and the treason she had witnessed, he immediately sent word to contacts at the Home Office. Within hours, 3 government officials arrived at Westland's home. They questioned Marianne extensively, and she answered every question with painful honesty. She described the men who had visited Edmund, the conversations she had overheard about selling military intelligence to French agents, the locations of smuggling operations along the coast. Everything she had kept buried out of fear came spilling out. The officials exchanged glances as she spoke. Finally, the senior man, a stern-faced bureaucrat named Morrison, said, "Mrs. Ashton, what you're describing corroborates intelligence we've been gathering for months. We've known about this smuggling network, but haven't been able to identify all the key players. Your testimony could help us dismantle the entire operation." "Then you'll protect her?" Alistair demanded. "The men who came to my home threatened her life. We can offer protection, yes, but in exchange Mrs. Ashton will need to testify formally. Publicly, there will be trials." Marianne paled but nodded. "I'll do whatever is necessary." Over the following weeks, the government moved quickly. Armed with Marianne's information, they raided suspected smuggling locations and arrested dozens of men involved in the network. The conspiracy reached higher than anyone had anticipated. Several minor nobles were implicated, along with corrupt customs officials and even a member of Parliament. The scandal dominated London society. Marianne was kept under guard at a safe location, giving depositions and preparing for trial. Alistair remained at her side throughout, using his influence to ensure she was treated with respect rather than as a criminal. Lord Westland proved invaluable, leveraging his connections to fast-track the legal proceedings and ensure Marianne's safety. The trials began in autumn. Marianne testified in closed proceedings, her voice steady as she recounted what she had witnessed during her marriage to Edmund. The defense attorneys tried to discredit her, suggesting she was a bitter widow seeking revenge, but the corroborating evidence was overwhelming. One by one, the conspirators were convicted. Several were sentenced to hang for treason. Others received lengthy prison terms. Throughout the ordeal, public opinion shifted dramatically in Marianne's favor. Initially, there had been whispers about her, questions about why she had fled her marriage, suggestions that she had been complicit in Edmund's crimes. But as the full story emerged of her abuse and captivity, of her courage in coming forward despite grave danger, the tide turned. Newspapers praised her bravery. Society ladies who had once might have shunned her now called her heroic. Alistair's role in protecting her elevated his own reputation considerably. He was seen as a man of principle, who had risked his standing to shield an innocent woman from dangerous criminals. His political allies grew in number, and his influence in Parliament increased. By winter, the last trial had concluded. The smuggling network was destroyed. The men who had threatened Mary Ann at Pemberton House were either in prison or dead. Morrison came to inform them personally that the threat was over. "You're free, Mrs. Ashton," he said. "Truly free. There's no one left to pursue you." Mary Ann looked at Alistair, her eyes shining with tears of relief. For the first time in years she could breathe without fear. She could use her real name. She could stay in one place. She could build a life without constantly looking over her shoulder. "Thank you," she whispered. Alistair took her hand. "Now we can finally move forward, together." With the trials concluded and Mary Ann's safety assured, Alistair wasted no time. The morning after they received confirmation that the last conspirator had been convicted, he took Mary Ann to the gardens at Westland's estate where they had been staying. The early winter sun broke through the clouds, casting everything in soft gold light. He took both her hands in his and looked into her eyes with absolute certainty. "Mary Ann Morton, I've waited long enough. I've loved you since the first time I heard you read to my children. I've admired your courage through every trial we faced. And now that you're finally free, truly free, I'm asking you properly. Will you marry me? Not to save you, not to protect you, but because I cannot imagine my life without you in it. Because you've brought light back into my world. Because I choose you every day for the rest of my life." He produced a ring from his pocket, a sapphire surrounded by diamonds that caught the morning light. The blue stone reminded him of summer skies and hope. Mary Ann's hands trembled as she looked at it, then back at his face. "Yes," she said, her voice breaking with joy. "Yes, Alistair. 1,000 times yes. I choose you too. I choose this life we can build together. I choose to stop running and start living." He slipped the ring onto her finger and kissed her there in the garden while Lord Westland diplomatically turned away to examine some distant hedge. When they finally pulled apart, both were laughing through tears. The wedding was arranged quickly. Alistair saw no reason to wait, and Mary Ann agreed. They were married 6 weeks later at St. George's, Hanover Square, in an intimate ceremony. Thomas, now 11, stood proud as groomsman, and Georgiana, 9, served as bridesmaid with flowers in her hair. Lord Westland gave a toast that had half the small congregation wiping their eyes. Lady Herwood, a distant cousin of Alistair's, served as witness and pronounced it the most romantic thing she had seen in decades. Mary Ann wore ivory silk, with delicate lacework that Alistair had commissioned specially. Her dark hair fell in soft waves down her back, and she carried white roses mixed with violets. When she walked down the aisle, Alistair felt his breath catch. She was radiant, not just beautiful but luminous with happiness. The haunted look that had shadowed her eyes for so long was finally gone. The vows were simple but profound. Alistair promised to see her fully, to honor both her strength and vulnerability, to protect her not because she needed saving, but because they chose each other. Mary Ann vowed to stop running, to build roots with him, to love his children as her own, and to trust him with the heart she thought was broken beyond repair. When the vicar pronounced them husband and wife, Alistair kissed her as though sealing a sacred promise. The small congregation erupted in applause, and Thomas and Georgiana rushed forward to embrace them both, their faces alight with joy. The wedding breakfast was held at Pemberton House, which had been transformed for the occasion. Every room blazed with candles and winter flowers. The staff had outdone themselves, and even the usually reserved Mrs. Patterson was seen dabbing her eyes with her apron. The children stayed close to Mary Ann all day, as though afraid she might disappear if they let her out of their sight. She held their hands and laughed at their jokes and promised them that she was staying forever. That night, after the guests had departed and the children were finally asleep, Alistair and Mary Ann stood together in the library where they had shared so many quiet moments. He wrapped his arms around her from behind, and she leaned into him with complete trust. Happy? He murmured against her hair. Happier than I ever thought possible, she answered. I came to your house expecting to hide. Instead, I found home. We found each other, Alistair corrected. Everything else was just details. She turned in his arms and kissed him, and in that moment the past finally released its hold on both of them. They were no longer a widowed duke and a fugitive governess. They were simply Alistair and Marianne, two people who had found love in the unlikeliest of circumstances and chosen to build a future together. 1 year had passed since Marianne Morton became the Duchess of Pemberton, and the transformation of both the family and the house was nothing short of miraculous. On a crisp autumn morning, Marianne stood at the doorway of the schoolroom, the very place where her journey with this family had begun, and smiled at the scene before her. Thomas, now 12, sat at his desk working intently on an essay about Shakespeare's themes of redemption. Georgiana, 10, practiced a complex piano piece in the corner, her fingers moving with confidence across the keys. The room that had once felt cold and formal now overflowed with life, books stacked on every surface, artwork pinned to the walls, musical instruments propped in corners, evidence everywhere of curious minds at work. Marianne no longer entered this room as a hired employee, careful to maintain proper distance and authority through formality alone. She entered as a mother, as the woman these children had chosen to love and who loved them fiercely in return. Her role had evolved from teacher to family, from outsider to the very heart of Pemberton House. When she spoke now, it wasn't with the careful neutrality of someone afraid of overstepping boundaries. It was with the warmth and authority of someone who belonged completely. "How is the essay progressing, Thomas?" she asked, moving to look over his shoulder. He glanced up with a grin that reminded her so much of Alistair. "I'm arguing that Shakespeare believed broken people could be made whole again through love and forgiveness. Do you think that's too sentimental?" Marianne felt her throat tighten with emotion. A year ago, this boy had been silent and withdrawn, barely able to speak about feelings at all. Now he wrote essays about healing and redemption. "I think it's profound," she said softly. "And I think Shakespeare would agree with you. Some of his greatest characters are people who've survived terrible things and found their way back to wholeness." "Like you," Georgiana said from the piano, not missing a note. The observation was matter-of-fact, without any awkwardness. The children knew Marianne's story now, not all the dark details, but enough to understand that she had survived hardship and found happiness. It had made them love her more, not less. "Like all of us," Marianne corrected gently. "We 385 all carry wounds. The question is whether we let them define us or whether we choose to heal." Thomas nodded thoughtfully and returned to his writing. Georgiana finished her piece and immediately launched into another, this one a duet she and Marianne had been practicing. Marianne moved to the piano and added her part, their voices blending in harmony that filled the room with warmth. This had become their ritual, music in the mornings, literature in the afternoons, and always the space for questions and conversation and the kind of learning that went far beyond textbooks. Alistair appeared in the doorway, drawn as he so often was by the sound of music and laughter. He leaned against the frame, watching his family with an expression of deep contentment. Marianne caught his eye and smiled, and the look that passed between them needed no words. They had built this together, this life, this family, this home that had been cold and silent and was now warm and alive. Later that afternoon, after lessons concluded and the children went riding with one of the grooms, Alistair and Marianne walked together through the gardens of Pemberton House. The autumn leaves crunched beneath their feet, and the air carried the scent of wood smoke from distant cottages. Alistair held her hand, his thumb tracing absent circles on her palm, a small gesture of affection that had become habit. "I've been thinking about that first day," Marianne said. "When I arrived here, terrified and desperate, lying about everything except my ability to teach. I thought I was looking for a place to hide for a few months before moving on again. I never imagined—" She paused, overcome with emotion. "I never imagined I would find this. A family. A home, you." Alistair stopped walking and turned to face her, taking both her hands in his. "I've been thinking about that day too. I thought I was hiring a governess to solve a problem. My children were broken, the house was filled with grief, and I was drowning in responsibilities I couldn't manage. I thought if I could just find the right teacher, someone who could reach Thomas and Georgiana, then maybe we could all start healing." He lifted one hand to cup her face tenderly. "I had no idea that the woman who walked through my door would save not just my children, but me. That she would teach me how to feel again, how to hope again, how to love again." "We saved each other," Marianne whispered, echoing words they had spoken before. "You gave me safety when I had none. You stood beside me when I expected to face everything alone. You loved me not despite my past, but as a complete person, flawed and wounded and real. And you brought light back into this house," Alistair said. "You taught my children that joy was still possible after loss. You showed them that broken hearts could heal. And you reminded me that life is worth living, even after tragedy, especially after tragedy." They continued walking, and Marianne found herself reflecting on the journey that had brought them here. The fear and desperation of her arrival, the gradual building of trust as she worked with Thomas and Georgiana. The night Alistair had listened outside the schoolroom door, drawn by her voice, but really drawn by what that voice represented. Authenticity, warmth, the possibility of connection. The terrifying moment when her past caught up with her, and she had to choose between running again or trusting Alistair to help her face it. The trials and the vindication, and the slow, steady building of a new life free from fear. "Do you ever regret it?" Alistair asked suddenly. "Stopping here, staying, taking the risk of letting yourself be known?" Marianne looked at him with absolute certainty. "Never. Not for a single moment. Running kept me alive, but it wasn't living. This," she gestured toward the house, toward the life they had built, "this is living. Waking up every morning without fear, watching Thomas and Georgiana grow and flourish, working on the Morton Foundation with you to help other women escape dangerous situations, being part of something larger than my own survival." She squeezed his hand. "And loving you, being loved by you, that most of all." The Morton Foundation had been Alistair's idea, a project they now ran together. It provided assistance to women fleeing abusive marriages or dangerous circumstances, offering them financial support, legal help, and safe places to stay while they rebuilt their lives. Marianne interviewed every applicant personally, and Alistair used his political connections to push for legal reforms that would make it easier for women to leave violent husbands. It had become their shared mission, a way to transform Marianne's painful past into purpose. That evening the family gathered in the music room, as had become their custom. It was a routine they all cherished, an hour before dinner, when they simply spent time together without the formality of lessons or the distractions of outside responsibilities. Georgiana played a simple piece on the pianoforte, while Thomas sat nearby with a book of poetry, occasionally reading a verse aloud. Alistair and Marianne sat together on the settee, her head resting on his shoulder, his arm around her waist. This was the life Marianne had never dared dream of during those years of running and hiding. This peace, this belonging, this sense that she was exactly where she was meant to be, with people who loved her not for what she could provide, or how well she could disappear, but simply for who she was. Later, after the children were in bed and the house had settled into quiet, Alistair and Marianne returned to the library. It had become their sanctuary, the place where they talked about everything and nothing, where they made plans and shared fears and simply existed together. Tonight Alistair poured 2 glasses of wine, and they sat together on the window seat looking out at the stars. "Tell me something," Alistair said. "When you first arrived here, when you were still so guarded and frightened, did you ever imagine we would end up here? Like this, Marianne considered the question carefully. Honestly? No. I thought I would teach your children for a few months, then disappear again before anyone got too close. I thought I would always be alone, always running, always afraid. The idea that I could have this, a husband who loves me, children who call me mother, a home that's truly mine, it seemed impossible. She turned to look at him. But then you started listening outside the schoolroom door. Alistair laughed, slightly embarrassed. You knew about that? Of course I knew. And it terrified me at first because I realized you were seeing me. Not just the role I was playing, but me. The real me underneath all the carefully constructed defenses. And being seen was the most dangerous thing I could imagine. She touched his face gently. But it was also what I needed most. To be fully known and still be loved. You gave me that gift, Alistair. You saw all of me. The fear, the lies, the complicated past, and you loved me anyway. Not anyway, Alistair corrected firmly. I loved you because of all of it. Because you survived. Because you remained kind despite everything that happened to you. Because your voice, that beautiful voice I first fell in love with, was always telling the truth about who you really were, even when you were hiding everything else. They sat in comfortable silence for a while, sipping wine and watching the stars. Finally, Marianne spoke again, her voice reflective. I used to think my voice was my greatest liability. It was too distinctive, too memorable. I worried that someone from my past would hear it and recognize me. But you taught me that my voice was actually my strength. It was the part of me I couldn't hide, the part that insisted on being authentic even when everything else about me was a lie. Your voice was what healed my children, Alistair said, and what healed me, not because it was beautiful, though it was, but because when you spoke, when you read to them, when you sang, you were completely present, completely yourself. And that authenticity, that willingness to be vulnerable and real, it gave all of us permission to be vulnerable and real, too. Marianne leaned against him, feeling the steady beat of his heart, the warmth of his body, the absolute safety of his presence. A year ago she had been alone and terrified. Now she was surrounded by love, by family, by purpose. The transformation was almost too much to comprehend. I love you, she said simply. I love this life we've built. I love who I get to be with you. Thank you for not giving up on me, even when I was ready to run. I will never give up on you, Alistair promised, kissing the top of her head. We're in this together. For all the years ahead, whatever comes, we face it as partners. And in that moment, surrounded by books and memories and the quiet peace of Pemberton House, Marianne finally understood what home truly meant. It wasn't a place. It was this, being fully known and fully loved. It was the sound of children's laughter, echoing through halls that had once been silent. It was the touch of a man who had chosen to stand beside her through every storm. It was the freedom to use her real name without fear. It was waking up each morning with hope instead of dread. The Duke had hired her to teach his children. But together, they had learned the most important lessons of all. That vulnerability was strength. That love required courage. That broken people could be made whole. And that sometimes the voice you've been hiding is exactly the voice the world needs to hear.